Hello there, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the How to Read series, where we are about to dive into the sequel to Alvin in Wonderland, Crystal Rose. I'm super excited to be back here doing this with you once again. I'm also excited to be one step closer to the release of my newest chapter to this saga, Wonderhaven. So, let's begin. Prologue. Well, hello again, curious reader. It's been some time since we last met, although I would be a fool to assume that you are here just to visit an old friend. I would even go as far as to guess that the reason behind this is because my last story failed to answer some questions you have. Was it really all a dream? Or perhaps more importantly, have you been back since? As fate would have it, I have been to Wonderland again. Not so long ago, in fact. I didn't know it at the time, but this most recent visit would also be my last. Not only that, but it would prove to be my most significant. It changed me. Well, I believe change to be the wrong word. If I'm honest, it quite frankly showed me the person I was destined to be all along. No doubt now that more questions come to mind, but for those answers, you must once again listen to the story I have to tell. Before we get to that, though, there is something you should know. I wasn't exactly honest with you the last time we spoke. If you recall, I told you that I was no longer in possession of Alice's journals, and that they were waiting to be discovered by the next soul. This is not true. The journals have been with me the whole time, here in the asylum. That is, they were before they were destroyed. Now, don't ask a single question more. Let the tale I'm about to tell entangle you. Let the truth about Wonderland reveal itself to you, and see what remains of its savior, the man called Alan. Date: January, year redacted. Physician's name: Hart Gregor A. Patient's name: Little Alan. Sex: male. Age: 22. Birth date redacted. Case notes. Patient was committed to Ravenscrest Mental Health Facility with symptoms described as paranoid delusions caused by trauma. Could also be schizophrenic episodes, although the exact psychosis is unclear. Patient is persistent in his stories of a world he calls Wonderland. It is my belief that he has created this imaginary world to escape whatever triggered his current mental state. Though he has thus far been unable to part with this safe place, his acknowledgement and ability to separate the real world from his gives me hope of recovery in time. Treatment is as follows. Listen to and use Patient's stories of Wonderland to identify and isolate the emotional event or trigger, and then guide Patient as he self-builds mental blocks from Wonderland, eventually severing any and all connections from the world altogether, ending in a result of complete rehabilitation. Chapter 1. Coping Mechanism. White. Color used to describe a person with pure heart and a sane mind. Also the color that was blanketing the dreary streets of London on the day my story began. The snow seemed to hide the world underneath it, away in an icy embrace. On any other day, the wind would fail to drown out the moans and screams from within the Ravenscrest Mental Health Facility, the voices of the cases less fortunate than myself. However, on this day, even they seemed to remain silent. The only thing that seemed to puncture the wintry hold successfully was a little orange flame radiating from the front lawn, not too far from the entrance. Standing by it was a man and a woman staring into the fire as something became engulfed in contrasting colors. As they watched the contents of the fire whittle away to ash, the man stoked the fire and put something in it as he spoke into the wind. "That's the last of the journals," the man said as he stepped back from the flames. "Are you sure it's the right thing to do?" the woman next to him asked with concern in her voice. "It's what must be done," the man replied, with a sort of regrettable certainty. "The best chance for change is making it the only thing left to grasp onto, giving it no place to hide." The two watched the journal burn in silence, saying nothing more until the doors to the facility creaked open and a gentle voice spoke out. "He's waiting for you, Doctor." As if startled out of the hypnotizing dance put on by the flames, the man broke his gaze to look at the nurse, waiting for a response in the doorway. "Do you really think he's ready for this? That he can handle it?" the woman beside him intercepted. "He doesn't seem to have much of a choice now, but I hope so." The doctor began walking toward the door as he held back to the woman by the fire one last command. "Make sure there's nothing left." Then he walked inside. My room inside the facility isn't far from what you'd likely picture. A bed in one corner of the room, a desk not far from that, in front of a window, and a chair not far from the door. The real point of interest in the room were the walls, covered end to end with hardly a bare spot in pictures. I drew them, the recollections of my time in Wonderland and the creatures I met there. There were pictures of the Mad Hatter and the March Hare just sitting down for tea, the Tweedles taking long drags of their pipes as they tell a story, and the White Queen standing at the top of her castle stairs in all her elegance and majesty. They were all there, surrounding me. At the time, I didn't know if I'd see them or Wonderland again, so I spent the beginning of this day as I had every other, sitting in my chair daydreaming of the time depicted within the still images. This was disturbed only by a knock on my door and the sight of my doctor coming into the room. With a nose in a case file, the doctor gave a greeting. "Hello, Alan. How are we feeling today?" Still seated in my chair, I shrugged. Well enough, I suppose. Same as every day." With a chuckle, the doctor looked up from the file and replied, "Consistency seems to be your strong suit." He then moved across the room to lean against my desk and asked, "What about the nightmares? Are they still consistent as well?" I was quick to reply, "Ever present nightly." The doctor wore a puzzled look on his face as he now had laid the case file on my desk and gave me his full attention. You know we gave you medication for that, to hush the voices at night so you can sleep." He then cracked a smile. "But for them to work, you have to take them faithfully." I barked back, "I'm aware." The doctor replied, "And yet you avoid them?" As if frustrated to have to explain, I answered, "I don't want to place my faith in a drug." The doctor pleaded, "But they help you." "They help me what?" I interrupted. "Help me forget." The doctor didn't answer, so I continued. "Maybe I don't want to forget. In fact, Wonderland may be the only thing I want to remember." The doctor shot an intense look at me as I sprang up from my chair and turned my back to him. After a few seconds of looking away, I calmed down and faced him again. "Speaking of Wonderland, what adventure are we going to dissect today?" "None," he answered in a serious yet soft tone. He motioned to the chair. "Please sit." With a bit of confusion, I quickly joined with my seat once again and waited for him to speak. He turned his attention back to the case file and looked at it as though he was looking for some sort of answer from within. He cleared his throat and then commenced. I've recently reread your Aunt Alice's case file. You two are a lot alike. I was quick to dismiss this as I replied, I've been told. Without skipping a beat, the doctor continued with a sort of smirk, in more ways than you might think. With a finger tracing the file, as if hunting for facts, he continued, both of you experienced unimaginable tragedy at young ages, way younger than anyone ever should. She first, losing her entire family in a house fire, then you, first losing your father to unexplained circumstances, and then more recently, losing your mother to suicide. He took a breath and sounded sympathetic. I can't imagine what that must feel like. Before he got the chance to say another word, I responded in an annoyed tone. I know the story. I have heard it 1,000 times. I quickly questioned, what is this about, Dr. Hart? He cleared his throat and set the file beside him on the desk as he prepared to answer. You see, Alan, you've been in my care now since you were 15 years old. That's 7 years. While a person with trauma of your caliber would no doubt take a considerable amount of time to cope, the thing about my profession is we like to see at least some sort of progression toward rehabilitation. In the time that you've been here, while I wouldn't expect you to be 100% cured, I cut him off in a sort of aggravated calm. You don't think I'm making progress. I paused to let it sink in. But how am I supposed to progress if I don't believe I'm sick? With a sigh, Dr. Hart placed his hand on his chin and ignored my question completely as he went on. You came to me in such a fragile mental state, so taken by Wonderland, that tampering with your connection too quickly could yield catastrophic results. So I thought the best course of action would be to indulge in your stories, hoping that in time you would build the necessary mental dividers to essentially heal yourself. By this time, Dr. Hart was pacing in front of me. This is where I failed you. I failed to see that your belief in Wonderland could not be overcome on your own. He stopped pacing and stood directly in front of me. 7 years. After 7 years, you still lack the ability to see your imaginary world is nothing more than a coping mechanism. Truly aggravated now, I dug my nails into the arms of my chair and muttered behind gritted teeth, Wonderland is not a coping mechanism. How many times must I ask you not to call it that? Dr. Hart fired back in an escalated manner. I will not enable this behavior any more. It's time to call it exactly what it is. He pointed to all the drawings around my room. This, all of this, is nothing more than a delusion crafted by a hurt child whose view of this world has become tainted. He continued, scolding me further. I know you see it. You know the difference. I quickly tried to swallow my anger before rising to meet him face to face. I answered back in a hushed but still furious tone. What I know is this world is not Wonderland. I recognize the difference between this reality and that one, but I know that Wonderland is anything but a dream, and I can't in good conscience deny what is real. Dr. Hart muttered meekly in response, which is why this must be done. I stood there, giving a puzzled glance as I waited for him to correct my lack of understanding. He then drew a long breath and leaned back against my desk as he got straight to the point. I burned the journals, Alan. His calm demeanor was met with sudden rage. You what? You can't do that. Those are my things. Alice's things. The doctor's patience with my anger had clearly run out as he barked, Sit down, Alan. The order made me sink into my chair once again, as if my legs gave out. After some time to recapture his composure, he looked down at me as an apologetic parent would the child they've wronged. He then knelt to my level and spoke softly. As I said, this is all my fault. You may not see it, but I did this for your own good. Matching his tone, I asked, how is destroying my journals for my own good? Dr. Hart replied, change. With the journals gone, you have nothing left to cling to. Alan, you must believe that everything I've done, including this, is to help you. I didn't force you to face your emotions. Before, you just hid behind the context of the journals. I see now that what I thought was the correct form of treatment only brought more harm in the end. He locked eyes with me. You can't possibly tell me you want to spend the rest of your life in here when there's a chance you could be out there in society. I seemed to choke on my response. No. Dr. Hart mirrored. No, you don't. He then put a hand on my shoulder, rose to his feet, and walked around the room as he added, which is why we're going to try something new, a new treatment. A bit more drastic, sure, but likewise effective. I asked nervously, what is it? The doctor explained. Electroconvulsive therapy. We're essentially going to send an electric current into your brain, or shock it, if you will. This will trick your brain into building the mental walls that you failed to on your own. If all goes to plan, in the end, you'll forget all about Wonderland. Show enough improvement, and we might be able to get you out of here. In a state of shock, I asked, when do we start? As Dr. Hart collected Alice's case file off my desk and strode to the door, he replied, soon, within the next few minutes, in fact. I'm off to make the preparations, and I'll be back to get you. Before exiting my room, he added, this won't be like your medication, Ellen. There's no escaping this. With that, he was gone. I sat paralyzed in my chair. With tears in my eyes and hysteria looming, I muttered out loud, there's nothing wrong with my brain. There's no need to change. I don't want to forget. Over and over I spoke those words until I violently sprang up from my chair and screamed, Wonderland is mine. It's ours. They can't take that away from us. It exists. This outburst turned primal quickly as I threw the chair against the wall and pounded the desk until my hands became red and numb. Grasping my head in my hands in an attempt to quell my wild behavior, I began frantically tearing my drawings off the wall. One by one, the pictures were ripped from the places until blank spaces showed once more. I didn't have the heart to rip them up, so I collected them and placed them in a pile inside a drawer of the desk. When that was done, Mr. Hyde returned to Dr. Allen, with a fit of shaking and heavy breathing as I gazed out my window and at the world of white. My solace was interrupted by the appearance of bodies in my room once more. This time, it was Dr. Hart and two other male assistants. We're ready for you, Alan, he said as the three men entered my room. Surveying the evidence of my tantrum, he asked, will you come on your own, or will we be helping you? I turned from my window and said, as I wiped the moisture from my face, I've never not been compliant. The doctor smirked as he said, very well then, wise choice. He then motioned me to the door, and the three men guided me away. Chapter 2. The Raven of the Writing Desk. You know, I'd like to imagine that for a guy who wasn't sure what to expect, or if he would even be the same after, I walked down that hallway with my head high and no fear. Well, at least out loud anyway. On the inside, with every step, my mind was penetrated by the noises of the rowdy patients we passed on the way. They all reached out for me as I passed, almost as if they were welcoming me into their level of illness. Their eyes said, "You're one of us now." Then again, maybe they were trying to convince me to turn back before it was too late. After what felt like an agonizing mile, we reached our destination, a small room with a restraining bed in the middle. There was a lot of bodies in this room, way more than there should have been in my opinion. There was me, Dr. Hart, his 2 assistants, a nurse, and a technician. Once we all piled in, Dr. Hart put a hand on my shoulder and made an attempt to be comforting. "It will be over soon. I'll talk you through every step of the way," he said as he moved to the side of the bed as the 2 assistants grabbed me, one on each arm, and brought me down onto the bed. Once they did that, they moved on to securing me to it, buckling my hands and feet down. Amidst the involuntary resistance I was giving my tethers, Dr. Hart chimed in with a small smile. Relax, Alan. Just a precaution. Have to make sure you don't get froggy on us and hurt yourself." No matter how hard I tried to do as he asked, my instincts chose to keep fighting. The nurse that I saw when I came into the room was now seated by my head and was spreading lubricant on my temples. I locked eyes with Dr. Hart and asked, "Does it hurt?" He reached down and squeezed my hand as he replied, "Just for a second." The nurse then proceeded to place a mouth guard-like object in my mouth, and the doctor continued, "This is to ensure that you don't bite your tongue during the procedure. The lovely nurse here is going to hold your head still as well." As I choked on the mouthpiece a little bit, the nurse placed a strange-looking apparatus on me and secured it to both sides of my head. Once he saw that I was ready, the technician handed Dr. Hart a clipboard, which he glanced over before asking, "Is everyone ready?" After a short but confirming silence, the doctor answered his own question. "Right, let's begin." With a quick look of certainty directed at the technician, the doctor took a step back, and the knobs were turned on. I couldn't even begin to tell you what it felt like. All I know is I haven't felt that type of pain before, or since for that matter. The nurse held my head stationary as I convulsed around, the restraints on the bed doing their best to keep me in place. Oddly enough, as electricity ran through my brain, I still found myself able to have a moment of clarity. In that moment of extreme anguish, I realized that I really was no different from the moaning and screaming patients that echoed throughout the asylum. For the first time in my 7-year stay, I matched their wails of horror perfectly. I realized that I was now forever going to be one of those less fortunate cases. Eventually, it ended. The machine was turned off, the restraints loosened, and my agony ceased. For the most part, I felt no different than I had when I woke up that morning. But I was different. Somehow, I knew that I had changed. Inside, I came to grips with the fact that this machine would in time be the end of me as I knew myself to be. In time, the Alan Little that once walked into Ravenscrest would be gone without a trace. The walk back to my room was quite foggy. at first. The noises that had burrowed into my skull before had been replaced with an unrelenting ringing in my ears. Movements were now slow and sluggish. Faces that were once clear were now just blobs with no discernible identity. These symptoms lasted the entire length of the hallway. That was until we reached the door to my room. The fog was lifted by Dr. Hart speaking. Here we are, back home. With a smile, he opened the door and led myself and the assistants who chose to help me find my way safely into the room. The two men escorted me to my chair, sitting me in it gently before carrying on with their other duties. The doctor closed the door behind them, staying behind to share some final words with me. You did well today, Alan. I'm proud of you, he said as he moved to grab a glass of water from my desk that had apparently been put there while we were out. He then stopped just in front of me, pulled out 2 little purple pills from his pocket, and waited for me to respond. I did so by saying nothing and staring straight ahead, almost through him. He ruined my concentration by pleading, Come on, Alan, you need these. Especially tonight, you need your rest. In no mood to argue, I silently took the pills and the water from his hand and ingested both. The doctor rewarded me with a gentle smile of appreciation and said before leaving the room, Get some rest, my boy. I'll see you soon. I sat motionless in my chair for a while, staring now at the giant blank space on the wall in front of me. After a while, I stood up and ended the quiet by speaking out loud. I don't want to forget. I'm not going to forget, I chanted as I turned my attention to a certain drawer in my desk. I pulled out the stack of drawings and proceeded to place them in their spot on the wall once again. When each picture had found its spot, I took a step back to admire my handiwork. Shaking my head, I stated in a whisper, We're not going to forget, Alice. Feeling content now, I laid down on my bed and began to happily daydream while looking up at the ceiling. It wasn't long till I drifted off to sleep. This was the first honest sleep I had in ages. No voices, no dreams, just sleep. Looking back on it now, I can say that I most likely thought that I had slept through the night and woke up. Most likely thought that I'd sleep through the night and wake up to the typical sounds of Dr. Hart, or at least a nurse, making the usual rounds. To think this way, however, was quite foolish, because what actually woke me up was far more peculiar. It wasn't even the next day. I opened my eyes at dusk. The noises that stirred me were also anything but typical. This was because my room had been filled with the obnoxious squawking of a very disturbed raven who was perched just outside my window. When I came to and located the source of the wreck, I responded with few sudden arm movements and a good scolding, as if the bird could understand me. Shh! Shoo! Get out of here, go on, I barked. But the bird was anything but intimidated. When I realized the raven had fully intended to stand his ground, I decided the next thing to try was to get up from my bed, tap on the glass, and hopefully scare it off. Instead of this action being met with fear, it was met by impatience, as the raven squawked louder at me and began to peck at the window angrily. This startled me as I took a step backward, saying, All right, okay, have it your way, fella. What is it you want? Knowing that the bird couldn't possibly speak to me, I watched him closely, studying his movements and mannerisms. In doing so, I noticed that as he aggressively attacked the window, his beak was pointing in the direction of the door. Puzzled, I couldn't help but chuckle at the notion that the bird could be telling me to go toward the door. It seemed that the longer I stood in puzzlement, doing nothing, the louder and more impatient the raven became as he continued to squawk and frantically peck at the window. To appease him, I marched over to the door and peeked through the observation window at the top, in part to prove a point, but also to make sure no one heard me talking to a bird. See, it's just a door, and there's no one there, I insisted as I turned around to face the raven. Now, his attention was focused on a piece of blank paper and a pencil resting on my desk. After a second or two of staring at my desk, he again looked up at me to caw and peck the glass before returning his gaze to the desk. Afraid I was missing something, I walked across the room to address the bird. No surprise, I was once again confused as I watched the bird alternate his gaze from the desk to the door with a caw and a peck. It took a bit of studying before I got the courage to ask, "You want me to put the paper on the door?" The bird cocked his head at me as if I was stupid and answered with a disgusted caw before pecking the glass. I thought a little longer and a little harder before I asked, "Do you want me to draw a picture of the door?" This time, the raven acted not in disgust, but excited as he cawed loudly and flapped his wings wildly in what I assumed to be approval. Wasting little time, I drew a crude-looking door on the piece of paper and showed it to the bird for yet more approval. "There, now what?" I asked the bird. He must have been content with it, because he was now looking at the wall between my desk and bed. "You want me to hang it up?" I asked. The raven cawed insistently in the direction of the wall as I added, "It's not going to do anything, but all right." I quickly put the drawing on the wall, so I didn't keep my feathered friend waiting. I took a step back to prove yet another point. See? Nothing. The bird must have had enough of my lack of faith in him, because he squawked loudly once more, before finally flying off his perch. I watched him fly off into the distance and shook my head. Silly bird. I then turned my attention from the window to the picture of the door. Feeling it was out of place compared to the rest of my drawings, I put a hand out to take it down from the wall. As I laid my hand on it, something strange abruptly came over me. A chill ran down my spine as I suddenly lost all ambition to take the paper away from its resting place. I took a few steps back from the wall in an attempt to gather myself. "Nothing," I said with a chuckle, as I leaned against my desk and looked at the abundance of Wonderland images along the walls. With a smile, I seemed to correct myself. "I suppose anything is possible there." For whatever reason, don't ask me why, I felt compelled to do something very curious. I again looked at the picture of the door, sticking my hand out in front of me, and proceeded to knock on the wall. When nothing happened, doing it once seemed improper, so I knocked on the door again, and for good measure, one more time after that. This time, when nothing happened, I instantly began laughing to myself rather hysterically at the whole idea that part of me actually believed something could happen when I knocked on a picture of a door that a raven insisted I hang on my wall. I seemed to only laugh harder and harder at this fact, and I began to pound the picture with my fist as I cackled. As if my interactions with the bird and the drawing weren't bizarre enough, what happened next certainly was. My laughter was suddenly interrupted by a small but very noticeable cracking noise coming from the wall. As the noise got louder, I quickly jumped back, away from the wall, to what I thought was a safe distance in the middle of the room. Just then, a big crack became visible as it ran down the length of the wall, forming what oddly took the shape of a door. After a slight pause, the entire section of wall swung open, revealing an overpowering white light. As the mysterious light illuminated my whole room, the rest of the wall once again fell quiet. And I stood there, breathing heavily and alone. My first instinct when it came to the giant door in my room was to quickly check to make sure no one was coming. When I looked out the observation window, everything was as it should be, quiet and peaceful in its own way. After I realized that my room was the only one affected by the magic door, and the rest of the facility remained oblivious, I knew what this was, why it was here, and what waited on the other side. I turned from the door, taking a few deep breaths, and walked toward the light. Before stepping through, I found myself only able to mutter the words, "Anything is possible." Chapter 3. An Abandoned Throne. Light. Through the door, there wasn't a single place for shadow to hide. There wasn't any doubt in my mind where I was going now as I was washed in brilliance. I knew that when I stepped through what waited on the other side was no longer the grey streets of London, no longer my cage in the asylum. I would be free. Free to hear the birds, smell every flower, and be in the company that would not condemn me for my unwavering belief in the impossible. For the first time in 9 years, I was home again. A hero, and not a patient. This was it, if only Dr. Hart could see. Wonderland. It was very clear that this wasn't the Wonderland I had left all those years ago. There were no songbirds greeting me, not a single flower in bloom. Not even the sun was comfortable showing its face. What remained instead was cold. It was as if death had swept over the castle, taking the souls of the kingdom with it. Something horrible had happened here. That was clearly evident. I paused in horror as I looked over the countless bodies of the White Queen's soldiers that lay in lifeless heaps all over the ground. The once radiant colors of the area around the castle had become dulled and masked by the color of crimson splatters and ash of the charred ground. Nothing moved except the smell of decay on the wind. I took still images of this scene as I stood as breathless as the world around me. As quickly as it had left, the sense of loneliness I deserted had found me again. After a few moments, in shock, the stale air was disturbed by the sound of cawing. I looked over my right shoulder just in time to watch the raven that brought me here soar overhead. Just as Wonderland had changed drastically, I noticed that my feathered guide had done the same. He had gone from an ordinary bird that you might see outside your window to something more to something only the impossible could produce. Just behind his normal set of wings was another that alternated motion as they carried him toward the castle. He cawed, and it echoed off the blood-stained walls. It became natural for me, after the raven's actions moments before, to assume he wanted me to follow his path to the castle. I didn't question him this time, as I quickly set off to walk amongst the bodies that lined the way. With each step closer to the castle, the smell of blood and burned flesh only got stronger. As I stepped over the countless fallen, I noticed two things. First, I saw that all the dead belonged to the Queen, with no sign of an enemy force. Second, I happened to catch a glimpse of some of the men's faces. Once strong and fearless, they now showed impressions of shock and bewilderment. I instantly became both curious as to what could scare men like these and hesitant to find out. As I crept up the stairs to the main door, I couldn't help but hope that the inside, whatever may be waiting for me, was less bleak. Unfortunately, the scene inside was just as grim. I slipped through the massive door as quietly as I could, just in case I wasn't alone. What greeted me in the throne room was just more of the same. Blood, ash, mutilation, and horrified faces. It was mesmerizing. The only thing that was able to worm its way through my trance was a sudden and loud squawk. I shook off my daze and looked around for the source of the disturbance. High in the rafters of the grand hall sat an odd-looking raven that was once again working for my attention. Now he seemed to be motioning toward the throne, which sat at the end of the room. The throne was untouched by the grim that filled the rest of the hall, but it strangely sat empty. Desperate for an explanation, I looked up again at the bird and inquired, "Is this why you brought me here?" The bird could only caw in response. Just then, a loud noise in the next room stole the attention of both myself and the raven. Realizing I wasn't alone, I scrambled to find something to defend myself with. I scanned the bodies for a weapon and found a bloody sword, which I snatched up from the ground as I braced myself against the door to the next room. This was the dining hall. While words were inaudible through the thick door, there was definitely someone or something there. I took a deep breath, knowing that the second I opened this door, there would be a fight. My first one since I slayed the Red Queen. I gripped the sword tightly and prepared to breach. Without another thought, I pushed the door, and as it swung open, I threw my sword back, ready to meet the intruder with a fierce blow. Much to my surprise, when I barged into the room, I found that the noise didn't come from intruders at all, and furthermore, no one had intentions to attack me. Seated at the White Queen's table was none other than a band of curious fellows that brought me to the castle all that time ago. The Mad Hatter sat at the head of the table, the March Hare to his left, and to his right sat the twins, Tweedledee and Tweedledum. It seemed to me they had been sitting around sorrowfully sipping tea, and my initial intrusion startled everyone out of their slump. The Hare was the first to react by jumping clear out of his chair and hiding behind Hatters. The commotion caused the other three to glance at the door, and in seconds, the very clear expressions of dread turned to smirks. Hatter scooted out from the table and jumped up, saying, "Alan, my boy, how nice of you to drop by." As he came closer to me, he placed his hands on my shoulders and added, My, I think you've grown since the last time we saw each other. Have you grown?" As happy as I was to see my friends again, a normal greeting eluded me. Instead, I asked the burning question in my mind. Hatter, what happened here? In an eerie, yet not uncommonly playful manner, Hatter responded as he glanced around the room. Oh, this? This was just a teeny tiny tea party that got just a smidge out of hand. He was quick to change the subject. Come, would you like some tea? Come have some tea, he urged, leading me to a seat at the table. Here, give our friend here his lumps, he demanded. The March Hare, who now had his head poking out from behind Hatter's chair, asked with a jittery giggle, How many would you like? Just then the Irish twins to his right finished his sentence. First Dum said 1, then D finished by adding, or 2. As I took my seat at the foot of the table, I replied sternly, No tea. I want to see the White Queen. Where is she? I set the sword on the table in front of me and waited for an answer as everyone took their places. The twins once again spoke, taking turns. D said unavailable, as Dum added indisposed. With an excited cackle, the March Hare blurted out, or disposed of. Hatter was quick to silence the statement as he aggressively nudged the hare, which only made him laugh harder. I'm afraid she isn't here at the moment, Hatter said calmly. I'm sure she'll return any moment, though. You're welcome to wait here with us. Where is she? I asked. Hatter quickly fired back as if hiding something. Nowhere. Again, the March Hare blurted out with a laugh. Everywhere. As Hatter frantically struggled to subdue the hysterical animal, my patience began to wear thin. What happened here? Why have I come back to Wonderland? I exclaimed. In a puzzled tone, Hatter asked, What do you mean? I spoke firmly. I'm here for a reason. Alice and I don't come just for tea. She came to Wonderland to kill the Jabberwocky, and last time I came to fulfill the prophecy against the Red Queen. Now, after all this time, I come back to this massacre, and the White Queen has seemed to have abandoned her throne. What has happened? Hatter stood in a sort of stunned silence, unable to speak. That's when a voice from over his shoulder spoke and broke the silence. Come now, Hatter, stop toying with him. It's quite obvious that this isn't the same Alan from before. He's harder to trick. As the voice finished speaking, a feline figure began to form and was perched on top of Hatter's seat. It was the Cheshire Cat. His yellow eyes and menacing grin were fixed in my direction. Chesh, I exclaimed happily. It's good to see you. The cat seemed unimpressed. Is it? He asked. Hard to believe, seeing as last time we saw one another, I was in chains. He yawned and stretched as he continued. Luckily, the Queen found it in her heart to expand my prison, letting me wander these halls at my leisure. I chuckled. You haven't changed much, have you? Chesh jumped down onto the table. No, but I see you have. Walking toward me, he went on. No journals, I see. Does that mean you believe in this dream now? He sat directly in front of me now. Out of instinct, I palmed the hilt of my sword, ready for any unpredictable movements. Chesh noticed this, and while casting a glance at my sword, he asked, Where are they? Gone, I stuttered. Gone, Chesh repeated doubtfully. He shrugged as he added, Well, I suppose both you and Hatter are entitled to secrets. He cast a grin at me once more as he jumped from the table. Secrets? What secrets? I asked urgently. Not mine to tell. He said, just before his tail and body began to return to its invisible state. With nothing left to see, the cat's voice spoke out. Good to see you, Alan. It then faded into the kitchen. Completely impatient with the whole charade now, I took my sword off the table and pointed it at Hatter. "What secrets?" I asked again, gritting my teeth in anger. With a sigh, Hatter choked down a sip of tea and replied, "There is a reason you're here." I urged him to continue with a fiery look in my eye. "Queen." Before he could continue, the Tweedles interrupted in unison. "Please, may we tell it, lads?" Hatter looked at me for approval. I placed the sword back on the table and replied calmly, "Please do." Without wasting another second, the Tweedles rose from their seats, took long drags of their pipes, and began. And that is where we're going to cut this episode, guys. I know it's a long one. These are this is a much thicker book with much longer chapters. So, let me know if the 3-chapter thing still works for you, or if these episodes get too long. I can always trim it down by a chapter and maybe just do 2 chapters per episode. But let me know. And until next time, guys, we'll see you later.